April 18, 1912, New York, USA. At around 9:30 p.m., amidst heavy rain, nearly 40,000 people waited with bated breath. It was a dark night, and a wave of grief was about to sweep across New York. These people had been eagerly waiting for 3 days for a ship named Carpathia. The Carpathia was returning with a heart-wrenching story, one that still sends chills down people's spines. A ship that was said to be unsinkable, the RMS Titanic, had surrendered hundreds of lives to the ocean. And on board the Carpathia were the survivors who had witnessed the Titanic's wrath with their own eyes. This is one of the most devastating incidents in history that no one can forget. It left behind many mysteries. Hello friends, I'm C.H. Alihater, and I welcome you to this video. April 10, 1912, when the Titanic was ready to embark on its first voyage from Southampton, UK to New York, the atmosphere was electric. So much had been said about the Titanic's size and grandeur that people flocked to see it. It is believed that over 100,000 people came just to witness the majestic ship. And why wouldn't they? The Titanic was truly grand. The ship was 269 meters long and around 53 meters high, taller than an 8-story building. From the outside, it looked magnificent, but the interiors were even more luxurious. The Titanic was like a floating luxury hotel, with 2 massive grand staircases, heated swimming pool, gym, 4 restaurants, library, Turkish bath, electric bath, barbershop, etc. But it wasn't just luxury that made the Titanic special. It was also its safety. The Titanic was considered the world's largest, safest, and strongest ship of its time. People even called it unsinkable. Why was Titanic considered unsinkable? Double-bottom hull. The hull outer shell was made of strong steel and provided the ship's core strength. To enhance safety, the bottom of the Titanic had a double hull, so if the outer one was damaged, the inner one would still keep it afloat. 16 watertight compartments. The bottom part of the ship was divided into 16 watertight compartments. Even if water filled up to 4 compartments, the ship could still float. It was considered impossible for more than 4 compartments to be damaged at once. Because of these features, people genuinely believed that no iceberg could sink the Titanic. The Titanic was built by White Star Line over the course of 3 years. It was completed on April 2, 1912. On April 10, 1912, it set out on its maiden voyage. On board were many of the era's elite, along with immigrants hoping to start a new life in America. The captain was Edward John Smith, 62 years old, a veteran mariner. This was supposed to be his last voyage before retirement. The Titanic carried around 2,240 passengers and crew. Even though the Southampton, New York journey usually took 7 to 8 days, the White Star Line wanted the Titanic to complete it in 6 days, showcasing not only its luxury, but also its speed. Thus, Captain Smith was instructed to maintain full speed. However, the Titanic was not properly tested before this journey. But there was pressure on the company. Their older ship, Olympic, Titanic's sister ship, had recently developed faults and was under repair. To keep business running, they launched Titanic early, even without thorough safety checks. Some experienced crew from Olympic were transferred to the Titanic. One such crew member, David Blair, was replaced by an Olympic officer. When Blair left, he accidentally took a locker key with him, which locked away the only pair of binoculars meant for the lookout crew. This small mistake would later contribute to the Titanic's demise. Finally, on April 10, 1912, the Titanic set sail. Captain Smith knew that icebergs were common in the Atlantic during these months. So instead of the direct northern route, he took a slightly longer southern route to avoid danger. Icebergs are giant chunks of ice that break off from glaciers and float into the sea. They travel from Greenland into the Atlantic. By the time they reach the mid-Atlantic, most melt, except the very large ones. There was no advanced technology on ships then to detect icebergs. So lookouts sat high up in a crow's nest, using binoculars to spot danger. But due to Blair's mistake, no binoculars were available. Ships used wireless radios to communicate iceberg warnings. Titanic received its first iceberg warning from the Caronia ship. Then another on April 14th, and several more throughout the day. Despite these warnings, ship owner Joseph Bruce Ismay, who was aboard, dismissed them. He didn't want the ship to slow down and miss its 6-day target. In total, the Titanic received 7 iceberg warnings. The final one came from the SS Californian, warning about ice ahead. But by then, it was night, the sky was moonless, and visibility was poor. The Titanic was moving at 40 kilometers per hour, very fast for a ship. The night of the collision, 11:30 p.m., April 14th. Titanic was just 6 kilometers away from an iceberg. In the crow's nest were Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, fighting freezing winds without binoculars. At 11:39 p.m., Fleet spotted the iceberg and rang the bell 3 times. The bridge crew immediately ordered the ship to reverse engines and steer left. But the ship was too large and too fast to change course in time. At 11:40 p.m., the right side of the Titanic scraped against the iceberg. The impact was massive. Passengers felt the jolt. The double-bottom hull didn't help because the damage was on the side, not the bottom. When Captain Smith assessed the situation, he found 6 compartments were flooding. The Titanic could only survive if 4 or fewer flooded. This meant the unsinkable ship was now doomed to sink. It had been 20 minutes since the collision, and at midnight, Captain Smith instructed the crew to send distress signals so that any nearby ship could come to their rescue. Wireless operator Jack Phillips began sending continuous distress signals. Unfortunately, there was no ship nearby that could receive Titanic's distress signals. 6 compartments had already flooded, and water had started overflowing onto the deck. Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats to be lowered into the sea, and all the lifeboats began to be brought out. Unfortunately, at that time, Titanic had only 20 lifeboats on board, and each lifeboat could carry only 65 people. So, with these 20 lifeboats, only around 1,200 people could be saved, while more than 2,200 people were on board. In the panic, the lifeboats were initially being launched with only 27 to 28 people in them, filling them only halfway. The protocol was to load women and children into the lifeboats first. Some people on board still believed that the ship could never sink and were completely relaxed. Meanwhile, Jack Phillips continued to send distress signals. Fortunately, one of the distress signals was picked up by a nearby ship, Carpathia, and at 12:30, a message came from the Carpathia saying it was coming to rescue the people on the Titanic. But unfortunately, Carpathia was still about 107 kilometers away from Titanic, and even at full speed, it would take around 4 hours to reach Titanic. Now the question was, could the Titanic survive for 4 hours? As water continued to fill the forward section of the ship, Titanic began to tilt forward and gradually sink. When the tilt increased, panic erupted among the passengers. By now, everyone understood that Titanic was going to sink, and people began scrambling to get a spot on the lifeboats. Priority was being given to first-class passengers. At 1:50 a.m., the last lifeboat was lowered, yet over 1,500 people remained on the ship. There was chaos everywhere. Those who could swim jumped into the ocean, but even the ocean seemed cruel that night. The water temperature was -2 degrees Celsius, and no person could survive more than 15 to 30 minutes in such freezing water. Some people accepted death and were ready to embrace it. Still, Titanic's crew continued sending distress signals and firing flares into the sky, hoping a nearby ship might notice and come to their rescue. But no ship came. The water filling the Titanic increased in speed, and it started sinking rapidly. The front part of the Titanic was now completely underwater, and the rear part started rising above the surface. Captain Smith finally told his crew to save themselves. But Jack Phillips kept sending distress signals selflessly. As long as there was electricity on the ship, Phillips remained in contact with the Carpathia, the only ship coming to help. Captain Smith chose not to abandon his ship. When the front part was completely submerged, a short circuit caused a complete blackout on board. The Atlantic Ocean echoed with the screams of people. The rear of the ship was now fully vertical in the air, and the pressure had increased so much that the Titanic split into two parts. At 2:20 a.m., RMS Titanic disappeared into the Atlantic Ocean. The unsinkable ship sank in just 2 hours and 40 minutes. Of the 500-plus people on board, some sank with the ship, and some died in the freezing water. Captain Smith remained on his ship until the end. About 2 hours after Titanic sank, the next morning, the Carpathia arrived to rescue the survivors. Only 706 people survived the tragedy. On April 18, 1912, at 9:30 p.m., Carpathia arrived in New York, where 40,000 people were waiting in the pouring rain. After this tragedy, many questions were raised that still remain unanswered. But during the investigation, a shocking truth came to light. Every person aboard Titanic could have been saved, because only 37 kilometers away, another ship was present, one that could have arrived in time to help. This was the SS Californian, the same ship that had sent the last iceberg warning to Titanic. So, why didn't SS Californian help Titanic? Investigation revealed that due to the risk of icebergs in the ocean, the Californian had decided not to move at night and had even turned off its wireless radio. That's why they couldn't receive any of Titanic's distress signals. When the crew of the Californian saw the flares and rockets from Titanic, they informed their captain, Stanley Lord. Captain Lord instructed his crew to send signals using a Morse lamp. The Californian crew kept sending Morse code signals using light, but the panic on Titanic meant no one noticed the signals from Californian. At that time, Morse code using lamps was common for ship-to-ship communication using dashes and dots. If only the Californian had kept its radio on, perhaps many lives could have been saved. Years passed since Titanic's tragedy, but the question remained: how did a ship believed to be unsinkable actually sink? That question could only be answered if the wreckage of the Titanic was found. Countless searches were made, but the Atlantic Ocean had hidden Titanic so well that no one could find its wreckage. More than 70 years passed searching for RMS Titanic's remains. Finally, in September 1985, a glimpse of Titanic's wreckage was seen for the first time. It was American oceanographer Robert Ballard who discovered the Titanic wreck. Since then, numerous studies have been conducted on the wreck. The research on Titanic's remains finally solved the mystery of why and how the unsinkable ship sank. Oceanographers were shocked when they saw the wreck. Titanic was split into two pieces on the ocean floor. The front portion was in very good condition, but the rear part was in such terrible shape that it didn't even seem like it belonged to the same ship. The rear part was about 2,000 feet away from the front. After extensive research, it was found that when Titanic was built, the rivets used to strengthen its hull were not made of steel, but of cast iron. This was a cost-cutting decision by the company. Since cast iron is softer than steel, the rivets near the point where the iceberg struck gave way under pressure, causing the hull plates to separate and allowing water to flood in. Today, Titanic's wreck continues to deteriorate under the ocean's harsh environment, and it's believed that in the coming years, even the remaining traces of Titanic may disappear. The Titanic tragedy was truly heart-wrenching. But nearly 60 years after Titanic sank, a similarly horrifying event occurred in the Andes Mountains. A plane crash on a desolate mountain thousands of feet above sea level. The survivors had no food, no shelter from minus 30 degrees Celsius temperatures. To stay alive, they had to eat the dead bodies of their own loved ones. The story of Flight 571 is truly harrowing, and you can watch it in the video shown on the screen. I'll see you there.